All right, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Shannon Sowell, and I work for Washington University Libraries Advancement. You are in for a treat with our presentation today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some Zoom housekeeping. As everyone entered the meeting, we have muted your microphones and turn off your video cameras. Please leave this as your status until we begin the Q&A portion of the presentation. At that point, feel free to turn on your camera so we can see one another, and you can unmute when needed. Once we begin the Q&A, please raise your hand on the Participants tab, and I will call on you and you can unmute yourself. If you would prefer not to be recorded, you can type your questions in the chat box and I will pose the questions for you. You can pose an anonymous question by selecting my name, Shannon Sowell, in the chat box instead of everyone. You can also use Q&A if you have any tech issues. And with that housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Cassie Brand. Cassie is curator of rare books at Washington University Libraries in St. Louis, and I know she is thrilled to have a means of sharing our rare book collections with you virtually, since we cannot yet welcome visitors back to Olin Library. Cassie's research focuses on the intersection of the book as a physical and cultural object and the histories of book collecting in libraries. In whatever spare time she can find, she is working on a PhD. Her dissertation, which is in progress, is titled How Books Became Rare: The History of Special Collections in America, 1880 to 1940. Her talk today is titled Beautiful but Labyrinthine: The Care and Storage of Fictional Books. Without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Cassie Brand.
Thank you so much, Shannon. If you'll just give me a moment while I share my screen. Okay, so I want to echo Shannon's thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be able to talk about Labyrinthine Libraries, which has been something I've been working on for a few years now. I'm going to start with a few quotes about libraries. The building itself is not only beautiful, but labyrinthine. I love just walking around the various floors and narrow corridors that lead to rooms I've never seen before. The library, with its Dotalayan labyrinth, mysterious hush, and faintly ominous aroma of knowledge, has been replaced by the computer's cheap glow, pesky chirp, and data spillage. He was educating himself in the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the Carnegie Library, where the scent of leather bindings, gilt-edged pages, printer's ink, and old paper engulfed him. When walking into a library, you probably expect to find a well-lit lobby with a reference desk, a circulation desk, and a librarian ready to assist you with any information needs. You probably expect easy-to-navigate stacks, not a maze with dead ends, and clear signage. But this is not always the case. Despite best efforts, many libraries are described as labyrinthine. The term labyrinthine simultaneously romanticizes the library, but also highlights its complexities. A labyrinth can be either unicursal, a single easy-to-follow path, or multicursal, a complex structure with choices of direction. The unicursal labyrinth is often found as a seemingly decorative pattern flat on the ground, which one is meant to follow while meditating. By associating the library with a unicursal labyrinth, people romanticize the ability to wander meditatively through the vast stacks, getting lost in a sea of knowledge without actually getting lost. A multicursal labyrinth includes twists and turns meant to confuse and disorient. Walking into a library for the first time can be awe-inspiring, but also intimidating, with a mass of books to navigate and choose from, making the multicursal labyrinth an apt metaphor. The labyrinth can also be taken more literally due to the confusing layout of many modern libraries. Additionally, the way the books wind through the stacks create the feel of a maze by making it necessary to walk back and forth down the particular aisles to find a book. Of course, I'm going to use the Olin Library at Washington University as our example for today. For those of you not familiar with Olin Library, it houses over 2 million books, and it has 5 floors, 4 of which are primarily used to house the books. Here's a diagram of level 2 showing the stacks and how the call numbers are arranged on this level. You can see that if you were to follow the stacks and browse all of the books, up and back each set of shelving, it would take quite some time and feel very much like a unicursal labyrinth. In fact, if you laid all of the shelves from level 2 in a straight line, that line would be 5 miles long. Level B, which has compact shelving, contains over 12 miles of shelving, and there's over 31 miles of shelving in the building as a whole, not including the vaults that house special collections. While no one would ever wander all of the shelves in a way that would lead to them walking 31 miles, this illustrates the ways in which libraries can easily seem like a labyrinth, just due to the nature of book storage. Apologies, I jumped ahead. When an author designs a fictional library as a labyrinth, he does so consciously, eschewing usual organization in order to create a specific atmosphere. Some labyrinths exist as scenery for the action of the plot, while others are intricately woven into the plot. Some characters must learn to navigate winding passages in order to complete their individual quests. Today, I will discuss labyrinth libraries in fiction with a focus on themes of navigation, organization, access, and preservation. And I have made sure to take out any spoilers in case you would like to read the books I'm talking about, and I will provide a list of books at the end. The Cemetery of Forgotten Books, depicted in author Carlos Ruiz Zafon's series, was conspicuously designed without any organizational system. The books sit on shelves, but also in piles throughout the labyrinth beneath Barcelona, with no regard for being grouped together by author, subject, acquisition date, or any other possible organizing factor. People can move books about without returning them to their original location, and there is no catalog to list the books held within the labyrinth. The lack of organization aids in the way in which the labyrinth operates. The cemetery is meant to be a resting place for books that are in danger of becoming lost forever. The books contained within the library are not meant to be checked out, read, and returned. They are meant to be saved. The disorganization of the labyrinth allows for only the guardian of the book to know its location, while other readers would not be able to find it or even know that it exists. The narrator of The Shadow of the Wind notes, quote, "Soon I realized that the folds of the labyrinth bent the passageways into spirals that were impossible to recall. 3 times I tried to follow a path I thought I had memorized, and 3 times the maze returned me to the same point," end quote. With the advice to remember the Minotaur and a borrowed pocket knife, he notches an X on each corner to mark each turn so he can find his way. Navigation of the labyrinth takes planning and careful attention to his surroundings. He cannot simply wander aimlessly. The organization of the Edificium, or library, depicted in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, similarly seems to have no organizing principle at first. The library catalog lists the books in order of acquisition, allowing the monks to request the books from the librarian and his assistant. They are the only 2 people who know the secrets of the labyrinth. Monks are not allowed to browse the collection or access the books directly. The books are listed with location codes written in the catalog, but they are meaningless without knowing how the labyrinth is laid out or how it can be navigated. As William of Baskerville and his apprentice Adso wander through the labyrinth, they are able to learn more about the organization of the books held within the Edificium. Above the archways, they find scrolls etched in the stone, each a verse from the Apocalypse of John, some in red and some in black. On their first visit, William and Adso are unable to navigate the labyrinth properly, becoming confused and losing their way several times. Before returning to the labyrinth, they use mathematics to better understand it. William reasons, quote, "The library was built by a human mind that thought in a mathematical fashion, because without mathematics, you cannot build labyrinths," end quote. They draw a map of the labyrinth from the outside, using reason to deduce the arrangement of the rooms within. They realize that the initial letter of each scroll marks each room, creating a mnemonic device which spells the name of a geographic location. When successfully navigating through the rooms, they find, quote, "The plan of the library reproduces the map of the world," end quote, with each country located within the labyrinth relative to the others. The chambers of the Northern Tower spell Anglia. The books are also arranged according to their geographic location, based on their country of origin. By understanding the geographic orientation of the books and geography in general, they are able to navigate to the different areas within the labyrinth and find the book they are looking for. Without an understanding of the way in which the books are organized, the characters would never have been able to navigate the library. Like in The Name of the Rose, classification systems help researchers find the book they want, giving each book a particular place in the winding stacks. Terry Bellinger's work, The Lunacy and the Arrangement of Books, shows that there is no shortage of systems that can be used to organize books, including size, color, geography, or subject. Books can also be organized into alphabetical order by author or title, or by accession date, meaning the date that the library receives the book. Part of the problem of classification is that there is no natural order to the books. Classification is entirely subjective, and often books fall into more than one category. Fictional libraries, such as the one depicted in Automated Alice by Jeff Noon, have a unique organizational scheme created by the author specific to his Labyrinth. Automated Alice is what Noon calls a trequel to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, drawing on Carroll's nonsensical style and continuing Alice's adventure into the 20th century. Alice comes upon what is called a labyrinth. After some trial and error, she learns that the secret behind the organization of the books, with some help from a librarian. The last 3 letters of the book title correspond to the first 3 letters of the next book's title. This organizational scheme furthers the theme of nonsense in the fictional world created by the author. Once Alice learns how the books are organized, she is able to find the book she is looking for, navigating past whimsical titles, including The Wasteland, Waiting for a Zozo, Hatch 22, and appropriately for this talk, The Gnome of the Hose. The labyrinth depicted in The City of Dreaming books and The Labyrinth of Dreaming books by Walter Morris creates a relationship between the books and the layout of the labyrinth. Book Home, the fictional setting of the novels, includes an underground portion of the city which, quote, consists of a system of subterranean tunnels that extends for many miles in the form of shafts, chasms, passages, and caverns entwined into one gigantic unravelable knot, end quote. The labyrinth between the city descends indefinitely, as the catacombs are never fully explored or documented. The labyrinth extends both horizontally and vertically beneath the city, allowing for an immense system of caves and passages. Book hunters, people who venture into the labyrinth in search of rare and valuable volumes, devise different ways of navigating the labyrinth. Quote, they marked bookshelves with chalk, unreeled balls of twine behind them, or laid trails of confetti, rice, glass beads, or pebbles, end quote. However, when the narrator, Optimus Yarn Spinner, is left for dead in the labyrinth, he has none of these to aid his navigation back to the surface. As he progresses through the labyrinth, Yarn Spinner finds that he does not have any way of orienting himself or knowing that he is traveling in the correct direction until he realizes, quote, the older the books around me, the deeper in the catacombs I must be. The more recent they become, the closer I would be to an exit, end quote. The layering of the city and the verticality of the labyrinth creates an archaeological sort of arrangement up for the books. Each newer set of books layers on top of an older one. By paying attention to the arrangement of books and by knowing his literary history, Yarn Spinner can navigate toward the surface to escape from the labyrinth. The organizational systems found in the Labyrinth libraries are either non-existent, like in the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, or take time to learn, like in all the other novels I've discussed. Both the lack of organization of some fictional libraries and confusing systems in others underline the nature of classification. Even within well-ordered libraries, classification can be difficult because it is an entirely subjective task. 2 catalogers may decide to class the same book in 2 different sections depending on their view of the subject. A single book can have multiple subjects contained within it, meaning that it can belong in more than one place in the classification scheme. Though the book might belong in more than one place conceptually, the book can only be shelved in one place physically. The fictional Labyrinthine libraries emphasize the problems with classification that libraries face. As reflected in the name of the rose, librarians are often faced with difficult decisions about which books should be allowed to be used by readers. While in the recent past, special collections libraries have moved to be more open and welcoming, there are a lot of factors at play in making the book available to readers. Subject matter, rarity, age, fragility, and value can all impact the decision to keep the book locked away and inaccessible. Special collections departments are often closed off in separate sections of the library because the books held within the department require different rules for their storage and use. Materials held within the department are usually fragile, rare, scarce, or valuable. Because of this, special collections employ a closed stack system in which the librarian or library assistant retrieves the book for the researcher. The books are locked away, making it impossible for anyone to browse the collection or stumble across items within it. This keeps the books safe from misuse, as they must be used within a secured reading room with staff supervision. While this reduces the possibility that harm will come to the book, it also makes the books less accessible. Rather than being able to go get the book and check it out, researchers must use the book within a specific place, often within limited open hours. The inaccessibility caused by the labyrinth helps to keep books safe. Wear and tear from reading, mishandling, or accidents cause books to be damaged or lost completely. As is said in The Name of the Rose, quote, "A book is a fragile creature. It suffers the wear of time. It fears rodents, the elements, clumsy hands," end quote. Many of the fictional labyrinths contain rare or scarce books in danger of extinction. The Cemetery of Forgotten Books is, quote, "the sum of centuries of books that have been lost and forgotten, books condemned to be destroyed and silenced forever, books that reserve the memory and soul of time and marvels that no one remembers anymore," end quote. Indeed, keeping these books and others like them hidden away and inaccessible helps them to survive. A book is much more likely to survive when kept in a locked vault with stable conditions and no one to ever use it. Furthering this idea of the locked vault, many of the Labyrinthine libraries have a librarian who acts as a gatekeeper. In The Name of the Rose, the librarian and his assistant are the only ones allowed to access the stacks, much like closed stacks in a special collections library. Without the ability to browse, readers must rely on the catalog to know what is available, and books can be easily left out of the catalog to ensure that they cannot be requested. Isaac, in The Cemetery of Forgotten Books, is a more literal gatekeeper. Only certain people are allowed access to the library, and he stands at the gate and only opens it to those who are allowed. The idea of a labyrinth as a cemetery shows up in several of the novels. When the antagonist reaches the Library of Alexandria in the Alexandria Link by Steve Barry, he finds, quote, "all around him were scrolls, papyri, parchments, and what the old man called codices, each one lying flat on the shelves beside the next, like bodies," end quote. The underground chambers act similarly to a crypt, with the books lying lifeless side by side. In The Cemetery of Forgotten Books, the books are held within the labyrinth, are often the last surviving copy, brought to the labyrinth to survive. The labyrinth acts as a resting place for these books that have been forgotten until they are rediscovered by a reader. The characteristics of the labyrinth add to the likeness of a cemetery, in addition to being named a cemetery. One character notes, quote, "more than ever, the Cemetery of Forgotten Books smelled of death." The Cemetery of Forgotten Books is a literal cemetery as well as a figurative one. Quote, "the floor we were stepping on was sown with tombstones, their inscriptions, crosses, and faces dissolving into the stone," end quote. Though the origins of the Cemetery of Forgotten Books have not been revealed, the reader learns that the labyrinth was built on an old necropolis, furthering this idea of the book cemetery. Walter Morris creates a similar setting in his Labyrinth. The title of the first book in the series, The City of Dreaming Books, refers to, quote, "antiquarian books," because they were neither truly alive nor truly dead, but located in an intermediate limbo akin to sleep. With their existence proper behind them and the prospect of decay ahead, millions upon millions of them slumbered in the bookcases, cellars, and catacombs of Bookholm, end quote. These books, much like those in the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, await a reader to pick them up and bring them back to life. The narrator, Optimus Yarnspinner, often refers to the underground labyrinth as the catacombs, strengthening the connection between labyrinth and cemetery, especially as he descends deeper and deeper into the labyrinth where dangers abound and people often die. The use of the cemetery metaphor strengthens the theme of inaccessibility. A cemetery or graveyard is meant to be a final resting place, a place that will not and should not be disturbed. By likening the labyrinth libraries to cemeteries, the author suggests that these books should be left to rest in peace. These books have reached their final resting place, and those who enter the labyrinths are disturbing a grave. Many might argue that rare books housed in special collections should be left undisturbed to be preserved for the future. By keeping books in an inaccessible labyrinth or special collections room, they are better preserved. However, those in opposition argue that the point of books is to be read and studied, not hid away from use. Librarians help to balance these differing viewpoints through proper temperature and humidity control and special handling, which helps the books to be preserved even while they're being used. 3 of the Labyrinth libraries depicted in the fictional works exist underground and discuss preservation conditions for the books: the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, the City of Dreaming Books, and the Labyrinth in the Alexandria Link. The underground location creates good conditions for the books stored within the labyrinth. The labyrinth beneath Bookholm, quote, afforded the ideal conditions in which to establish large-scale libraries. No injurious sunlight, low humidity, end quote. The low humidity and absence of sunlight allow for the books to be preserved longer without harmful ultraviolet rays or moisture that might encourage mold to grow. The stable conditions in an underground labyrinth would also help preserve the books longer. The books stored underground would experience less fluctuation in temperature and humidity due to weather. Also, hiding the book in a labyrinth can ensure that readers can't get to it. Labyrinths appear for many different reasons throughout the fictional works. They romanticize the ways in which libraries contain vast knowledge, stretching out in front of the reader, waiting to be explored. Labyrinths also add mystery to the novels. Creating mystery is another way of romanticizing books. It gives the reader something to discover or figure out, a reason to investigate. Fictional labyrinthine libraries magnify the difficulties of real libraries and point out the anxieties and contradictions libraries face. Problems with navigation of the stacks and organization of books become more acute in the labyrinth. When reading these novels, I realized that they had highlighted many contradictions and challenges that I deal with on a daily basis. Access versus preservation, organization versus time, and gatekeepers versus helpers. Each of these exists on a continuum, and every library may make different choices about where they fall on that continuum. In order to perfectly preserve a book, we would need to lock it in a climate-controlled dark place and never allow anyone access to the book. To allow unfettered access to the book would cause damage because even gentle handling can put a strain on the binding. Obviously, neither allowing completely open access or completely locking a book away are good options. Rules and regulations are in place so that libraries can allow access while ensuring as much preservation of the item as possible. Librarians want well-organized libraries, not labyrinths, with easy-to-find books, and a lot of this relies on catalog records and keeping books in the proper places on shelves. The more detailed and precise the catalog record, the more ways there are to find a book and to learn about the book before locating it on the shelf. But this type of detail takes time. Many libraries have backlogs of books still waiting to be cataloged, and new books are added to the collections all the time, making it necessary to balance how detailed a record needs to be with how many books still need to be cataloged. I would say most, if not all, librarians want to be as helpful as possible. It's one of the reasons we go into the profession. However, just as with all jobs, boundaries are necessary to be able to do our jobs well. Keeping the books, especially rare books, safe and preserved requires rules and regulations, some of which can seem very strict. Each of these rules helps us to preserve the books while also putting us in the position of a gatekeeper. Additionally, librarians can face issues of capacity in terms of how much work they can handle in a specific time frame. This often means putting restrictions on the amount of help we can give to one person so that we can help more people. I'm going to end with those thoughts, and as promised, here's a list of books that contain Labyrinthine Libraries in case you would like to read any of them. If you know of any books that contain a Labyrinthine library that I haven't included in this list, please let me know. I'm always looking for new ones, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cassie. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and start with one probably obvious question at this point is, where exactly does WashU Special Collections fall in the spectrum of preservation versus access? Do we have restricted materials? Like, what is our setup?
So I'm really happy that WashU is actually very open and very much on the access side of the equation. And we do have restrictions, but not too many of them.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I wasn't muted. So I will stop dominating the discussion and let people go ahead and raise their hands through the participant button. All you have to do is click on the little logo at the bottom that says participants, and there's an opportunity to raise your hand, I believe.
Yeah, and while you do that, I'm just gonna note some of the rules that we have for special collections. We don't allow any bags, food or drink, or pens into the reading room, which is pretty standard across all different special collections libraries. And as far as I know, there aren't any materials that you can't request other than the Declaration of Independence, and that's because it's on permanent display. So you can go see it in the exhibit chamber. But otherwise, we try to keep our books as open and as accessible as possible, again, while trying to mitigate those preservation concerns.
Okay, that makes sense. Elizabeth Brander, you have your hand up. You can go ahead and unmute.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, thank you so much, Cassie. This was great. I was curious if you'd started to come across any literature published kind of in more recent years that deals with the question of the internet as a labyrinthine library, since as a lot of formats are starting to be published in digital only format, or as a lot of people are starting to self-publish online through their websites or through blogs, that kind of, I think, is its own sort of labyrinth, kind of trying to navigate through the entirety of the internet to find material. And then of course we have a lot of gatekeepers such as Elsevier or, you know, other kind of paywalls that people might have to get behind as a form of gatekeepers. So I was just curious to know if you had maybe kind of seen any signs of that, maybe kind of being integrated into this sort of tradition of the labyrinthine library in fiction.
That is not something that I've seen, but that is an amazing point. And I think somebody absolutely needs to do it because you're right. There's so many twists and turns, and you can follow hyperlinks down dead ends and have to turn around and come back. And therefore, you know, there is such a labyrinthine quality to digital resources. A lot of the fictional labyrinthine libraries I was dealing with were very focused on the physical space. So I'm not sure how the labyrinthineness of the internet would play into that, but it would be something I'd be very interested in learning more about.
Thanks, Bess. Other questions, and feel free at this point to go ahead and take your camera, turn your cameras back on so that you can see everyone if you would like. So that is not a problem. I have one more. Tell me a little bit about, like, do you have a personal favorite classification system for organizing books? I can see behind you what looks like a lot of library books. So I assume the library obviously classifies its books, but tell me a little bit more about what you choose personally.
For work, my favorite classification system is Library of Congress. I very much prefer that over the Dewey Decimal System, and I have a whole rant as to why. For home, I organized my books a little bit more broadly. This is my dissertation shelf, which I have checked out from Olin and brought home with me so that the books could be close, reminding me that I need to read them and that I need to work on my dissertation. Whereas on this side, I have kind of my reference books about books, which is what I collect mostly. But here at home, it's more generally organized loosely based on subject.
So is there a way in which the structure of restrictive or segregated let me start over. Is there a way in which the structure of inaccessibility is a physicalization of the restrictive, segregated nature of academia? So how can we as librarians work to deconstruct the barriers to information that have been constructed to artificially complicate the quest for knowledge?
That is a really great and very large question, so I'm going to do my best to answer it. The profession has been talking a lot lately about digitization as democratization, because when we have rare books and special collections locked away in our vault, and you have to come to us to use them, and you have to go through our list of rules, which really aren't that restrictive, it still creates a lot of barriers. Every rule that we have in place is a barrier, whether or not that rule is appropriate. And a lot of the barriers are travel. It's very expensive to have to fly to a library to see a single book. And so digitization can really help to lower those barriers. But of course, there's also problems with digitization because you don't get the full experience of the physical book. And so digitization can act as a surrogate in a lot of ways, but it can't act as a surrogate in every single way. So I think that as a profession, we're really working on trying to figure out how to lower these barriers and how to make our collections more open and accessible through digitization, through virtual events, through allowing community members in a lot more broadly and openly.
So that leads me to the next obvious question is, so now that we're mostly offsite and away from the libraries, what does that mean for special collections and researchers and students and faculty continuing to use the Olin Library special collections? Do we have a general plan for that yet, or is it yet to be announced?
We are working on a general plan, but the general plan has not been approved. What we are trying to do is make the collections as accessible virtually as possible, so that we can lower any contact and any spread of the pandemic. Within that, we've also been talking about people who might need to see the materials physically and trying to make accommodations for those people. But again, nothing's fully decided, so I don't have any firm answers.
Okay, that makes sense. I think that's just going to be our next step in trying to figure out, because I know so many folks want to be a part of special collections and actually get in and do some research. And certainly we have collections that attract people from all over the world. What led to this research area in Labyrinthine Libraries? It's kind of an unusual one I hadn't heard about before.
Last time I checked, I'm the only one who's worked on Labyrinthine Libraries, and it comes from my obsession with the way that rare books are portrayed in fiction. One of the things that I started noticing when I started out in rare books is that rare books, you can't write an article about rare books without the word musty. And if your rare books are musty, there's a problem. You're not storing them correctly. We need to talk to our preservation people. And so that kind of led me down this path of, okay, why are all rare books called musty? Why are all rare books called old? Why are the only rare books that you write about worth several $1 million? And so I started working on just looking at the way that rare books were portrayed in fiction, and I started running across these labyrinthine libraries, which really got me interested in libraries in fiction, but also why would you set up a library as a labyrinth? It seems to defeat the purpose of being able to find books. And I started to see these themes of organization, access, navigation, and preservation. And I kind of love the idea that you can just hide a book in a labyrinthine library and nobody will ever be able to find it again, which is perfect preservation, but really terrible for access, and looking at those contradictions.
Interesting. Well, I have to admit that when you had us read, I think, The Spirit of the Wind for the virtual book club earlier, I guess it was last year, unfortunately it made me have to read the entire series, and it was a nice little rabbit hole to go down. Talk to me a little bit about the fact that I think bookstores in many ways, I know we're a library, but bookstores in many ways have an easier time of being that sort of cozy, hidden away place. You have to make sure you have accessibility to actually find and purchase what you need, but they seem to do that. Compare that a little bit to me, for me, with libraries.
I think that bookstores have more of this idea of the romanticized browsing. You walk into a bookstore and you may not be entirely certain what you're looking for, and you get to wander the stacks, and then a book jumps out at you and says, take me home. At least that's what happens to me. The books choose me and tell me which ones I should buy. But I think with libraries, especially research libraries like WashU, you're looking for a particular book that answers a particular question. And so it's much more of a, I need to go to the stacks and find this particular thing, and I need to be able to get there quickly and easily. Also, bookstores have a lot more turnover where they're getting stock in and pushing stock out, whereas research libraries tend to, for the most part, aside from deaccession, keep a lot of the books that we have. And so it's ever growing, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of libraries can become more labyrinthine.
Interesting. I think you had said that The Name of the Rose is also a film, or I know that's one thing I've heard. Tell me a little bit about examples of labyrinthine libraries in film or other media.
As far as I know, The Name of the Rose is the only labyrinthine library on film. And I decided to go with the book, even though I actually do enjoy the movie a little bit more. It's one of the 3 instances where I prefer the movie to the book. Sean Connery stars in it, which makes a big difference. And it's very enjoyable. I highly recommend watching it, if not reading the book. But yeah, I really haven't found many labyrinthine libraries. There is a new book by Erin Morgenstern. I'm completely blanking on the name. I just made Elizabeth read it. Maybe she can remind me. That has the Labyrinth Library, but they don't do anything with the Labyrinth Library. It's just a backdrop. So I didn't include that one in this talk. But again, if anybody finds any, let me know.
Perfect. Well, we actually had, fortunately, Bess wrote in, it's The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern.
Yes, thank you.
There you go. And it looks like Jill pointed out the Library of Babel.
Yeah, so I need to reread the Library of Babel because every time I talk about this paper, people remind me of it. And if I'm remembering correctly, it's ever expanding. And I remember that when I first wrote this paper several years ago, I ruled it out, and I can't exactly remember those reasons, and I definitely need to revisit it. So thank you, Joel, for reminding me of that.
That's great. And I think Danielle said that The Name of the Rose has recently been redone as a TV show. So now we can all check it out there as well. Very good. Tell me, let's see, I think we had an interesting comment from Sophia about the universe is a library built of hexagons, which is very clever.
Yeah.
Elizabeth has noted that the TV adaptation of Lev Grossman's The Magicians features a labyrinthine library, and it's mentioned in the books as well, but it's more developed in the TV show.
Thank you. I will definitely be adding that to my list.
Excellent. And Bess, you have your hand raised. You're welcome to unmute and ask your question aloud.
Yeah, I was kind of curious if you'd noticed if any of these books were talking about archives specifically as archives, or if the archive and the library were kind of conflated in some ways, since I was trying to think of books that really sort of talk about labyrinthine archives. And the only one I could really think of was The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankenweiler, if any of you have read that. It's, I think it's technically young adult, but basically Mrs. Frankenweiler has her personal archive that is organized in a way that only she can understand. But I feel like kind of usually when you think of it, I think that there are maybe more depictions of libraries rather than archives. So I was just kind of curious if you had any thoughts about maybe when authors of fiction who maybe aren't in the special collections world, do they kind of maybe not quite know if there is this kind of distinction between what is an archive or what is a library, or sort of are the libraries kind of the more overtly, my cat is coming onto my lap, the more kind of overtly romantic part of special collections, or just kind of any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so none of the books I read were dealing with archives in terms of personal papers. I think the one that comes closest is the Alexandria link, and it depends on whether or not you think of papyri as book or manuscript, and I think it could go either way, but it's all of the authors were specifically thinking like book, not more of the archival special collections personal paper side, which I thought to be very interesting. And I think it again romanticizes this idea of wandering the circulating stacks, and browsing in that meandering, wandering way. But also I think that there just isn't as much general understanding of archives, and I'm sure many of my colleagues would agree that personal papers and archives often show up as a messy labyrinth that nobody understands the organization of, and thankfully we have some really amazing, wonderful staff people who help to untangle that labyrinth for us before they're used by our researchers.
Okay. We have another anonymous question that poses the aesthetic of used, or one might say loved books that colors the depictions of these fictional libraries exist in very stark contrast to the emphasis on pristine quality and repair within special collections in the real world. So how does that idea of interaction and an active relationship with the book as object affect our role, or the role of librarians?
In my opinion, I love books that have been loved and used and that have marks of ownership. When I was in the vault last week taking those pictures that I used in my presentation, I found a book that has just been eaten up by worms, just absolutely devoured, and I love it. It's so interesting, and it makes that physical object even more of a teaching tool that I can use to talk about preservation and conservation and all of these things. I would say earlier in in book collecting, the pristine object was what everybody wanted. And so you have books being rebound because the old original bindings were ugly or not pretty enough or needed to be repaired, so they just rebound them. You have books that have been washed, so they actually remove ownership markings from the pages. And then you also have Frankenstein books where you take multiple copies of the same edition or even different editions and take the best pages from each to put them together and create a new pristine copy. We don't do that anymore, thankfully, because a lot of what I study and a lot of what we do is looking at the book as an object. And all of those signs of use are signs of that book's history. And so anytime somebody has doodled in a book, it tells us something about how that book was used. Now, nobody's allowed to doodle in our books in special collections in the reading room. Once the book comes to us, we try to stop that book from changing. But anything that happens to that book before it comes to special collections, I find really interesting. So my theory on preservation and conservation is that we do as little to the book as possible to make it usable. We have this really amazing, fantastic first edition of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven that has been rebound in a designer binding that I won't let anybody see because the binding has been water damaged and you can open it up about that far before the binding starts to break. So that's an item that I'm restricting until we can conserve it so that it can be used without damage. But that's pretty much the only times in which I would restrict something, and allowing a book to be used or be used safely is one of the reasons I would conserve it. Otherwise, I want the thing as it is.
Makes sense. Danielle has a question. Danielle, you want to take yourself off mute and turn on your video?
Oh, I don't have a question. I'm just Washington University's conservator for our library. So I wanted to weigh in on the idea of pristine copies and use of that. So, and my cat wants to weigh in on that as well, apparently. I apologize. I wanted to say that book conservators have also kind of followed that path of a few decades ago. It was common practice to restore a book to like new condition so that it would resell for more money. But as our ethics now lean very much towards doing as little as possible to make the book accessible to people, specifically because as Cassie mentioned, there's so much history and information just in the structure of the book itself and how it's been used. When I was in private practice, we had a client who wanted to make sure that we definitely didn't clean the pages of the Bibles that he had because they had been hidden in stables during one of the religious conflicts over in England, and the mud and that was on the pages was the history of the item and was its provenance as far as retaining that history. So conservators try to do, the good ones anyway, try to do as little intervention as they can so that people can have as much of that history remaining.
Absolutely, and I'm really excited about all of the technologies that are happening right now where like people are using micrometers to measure the amount of dirt on the pages to figure out which pages were used more than others within the book, which I just find super fascinating. And then they're also doing things to try to recover DNA, I think from Lincoln's Bible. Lincoln is in there somewhere. So if you're gonna watch the pages, you're gonna watch off that history, but also that information that can tell us more about the book.
I think we've got I know now I like a lot of people in this talk because there's a lot of talk about Haruki Murakami and his strange libraries and librarians that appear. I have totally forgotten about the Library of Unicorn Skulls, so that's kind of fun to do. We do have another question in the chat anonymously about, are there any real world libraries you or anyone else knows that has the same energy as some of these labyrinthine structures?
Ooh. Each of the fictional novels had a different energy to the Labyrinthine Libraries that it created, but I think that idea of this kind of romanticized wandering does appear in a lot of different libraries. I think it might be Seattle Public that has their stacks laid out so that you can walk through their stacks without ever retracing your steps, which, you know, really in that kind of unicursal labyrinth model, which I think is really wonderful. One of the reasons that I came up with this paper while I was at Drew University is that I found Drew University's library to be rather labyrinthine, just because the way that renovations were done. And in doing my research, I found a lot of articles in which library renovations create a labyrinth. So for example, at Drew, the original structure was 4 floors. And then they added on an annex that was 7 floors. And so the floors didn't match. And so you had 2 different elevators that you would have to use, or 2 different sets of stairs to get to the right place, along with figuring out like which side of the building you were on and which of the many different floor possibilities you had to be able to find the call number that you were looking for. And this is just a necessity of libraries who run out of space and have to add on in unique and interesting ways.
That's really interesting. So does anyone have any personal experiences with labyrinthine libraries or bookstores or places that they associate with this sort of feeling? Any thoughts? Please feel free to go ahead and take yourself off mute or show us on your camera. Any other ideas, Cassie, other than you're at Drew University?
I'm trying to remember, I think Kansas was one of the ones who had a renovation and everybody was like, it's a labyrinth now. So I think that just, it happens quite often. But as I showed with that level 2 diagram, if you wanted, you could wander miles and miles and miles within any library building.
Very good. Well, I will let you wrap it up now if anyone else, if no one else has any other questions, and we'll move on. Cassie?
Okay, so thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all for your questions and your comments. I am going to share my screen again. So that I can promote our upcoming events. So in August, we're going to have a busy week at the end of August. I'm very excited. We're going to have virtual book club where we're going to discuss the book Watermark, and I'll be doing a short presentation on papermaking. And then the following day, my colleague Sky Lacert is going to give a curator talk on illustration history and the D.B. Dowd Modern Graphic History Library. So thank you all again for attending, and a special thank you to our library donors for your support.